information. Traceability in products and stockpiles with a focus on COPs and chemicals in plastics.
Yes.
Right. So here today, we're going to hear keynote speeches, and after the presentations, you will have a possibility to give questions and answer session on this very hot topic, chemicals in plastics. Everyone is talking about it in the context of so many different things, but among others, INC process, as you might be all aware of. Right. So yeah, during this Conference of the Parties meeting, also there has been a number of chemicals being considered, but some of them are heavily used in plastics application. And so this is really fresh in our head, and still maybe coming 2 more days, 2 more days, Conference of the Parties sessions, the plenary will consider chemicals for listing under the Stockholm Convention. But let's now hear from our speakers. First in the list we have is Olga. I hope that I am still visible. Yes, so she will be presenting on regional and global developments on chemical transparency and traceability in products. And yes, Olga from HEJSupport have presentation slide.
So thank you so much, and thank you for the introduction, Kei. So my name is Olga Skaranskaya, and I'm a co-director, and the organization's name is Health and Environment Justice Support, or HEJSupport. And so I would like to start by sharing information about global and regional developments on chemical transparency and traceability in products. And next slide, please. So there are actually many reasons why it is essential to know what chemicals are in products, stockpiles, and in waste. And this information helps identify potential health and environmental risks and ensures that products are safe for consumers and do not adversely affect the environment. It helps manage the risks associated with the use, disposal, and recycling of products, leading to safer handling practices and a toxic-free circular economy that does not recirculate toxic chemicals in new products. And it also helps companies actually stay in compliance with regulations and contribute to innovations and safer alternatives. And definitely this type of information builds consumer trust and allows for informed decision-making throughout the entire product life cycle. And next slide, please. So the next slide, please. Thank you. And so today there are various initiatives going on at different levels, which focus on chemical information transparency and traceability in products, stockpiles, and waste. And these initiatives include voluntary intergovernmental agreements and legally binding international and regional agreements and new developments, like, for example, the plastics treaty negotiations. Next. So the first voluntary agreement that focuses on chemical information disclosure is the Chemicals in Products program. And this program was adopted in 2015 in the frame of the Strategic Approach to International Chemicals Management, or SACOM. And it provides guidelines for identifying chemicals with hazardous properties, which are listed on the slide. And while the program acknowledges the importance of full disclosure of chemical content information in products, it actually prioritizes the disclosure of chemicals with agreed hazardous properties. However, this program misses disclosure thresholds, which needs to be developed and agreed. And next slide, please. Yeah, so being a successor to SACOM, the global framework on chemicals adopted in 2023, so very recently, has two strategic objectives, directly focusing on access to information on chemicals for all stakeholders to enable informed decisions. And these objectives are listed on this slide. And next slide. And these objectives are supported by three targets aimed at making information on chemicals in materials and products available across the value chain and ensuring that such information is publicly accessible. And next slide. So besides these already adopted voluntary agreements, there are new initiatives which are currently under development. And these initiatives include the UNEP Global Framework for Digital Product Information System and UN Transparency Protocol. And both initiatives were introduced last week at this side event here at the BRS COPs. So definitely I will not go into details on this program, but I just want to say that these initiatives aim to enhance transparency and traceability in global value chains by providing detailed sustainability information about products, including material composition. And they sort of complement each other. They share insights and best practices and potentially align their standards to ensure consistency. And next slide. So the idea of developing these two global initiatives is largely based on the original legally binding approaches to information disclosure adopted in the European Union. And the EU has implemented the same basic criteria as the SACOM Chemicals and Products Program into their legislation for identification and disclosure of substances of very high concern. But the EU is also updating these criteria with additional hazards, like, for example, mobility of chemicals. So one of the EU requirements for chemical information disclosure in products is through the EU Substances of Concern in Products database, or SCIP database. And according to this requirement, companies supplying articles containing substances of very high concern at the concentration above 0.1% on the EU market, they must submit information on these articles to the European Chemical Agency. And this information is available throughout the entire life cycle of products, including at the waste stage. And one more initiative that I wanted to highlight here is the EU Eco-Design for Sustainable Products Regulation, or ESPR. And the ESPR Digital Product Passport helps stakeholders make informed decisions by capturing detailed information about materials, origin, and life cycle impact. And it also requires a transparency regarding the material composition of the product. And as it was noted also at the webinar earlier last week, the European Commission is working on including data about chemicals in the digital product passport system. And for instance, this digital product passport can include information on hazardous chemicals, such as, for example, listed under the Stockholm Convention. And the goal is to provide transparency about chemical composition, potential environmental and health risks, and support more sustainable and responsible product design. And next slide, please. So besides already noted global voluntary initiatives and regional EU regulations, there are global legally binding agreements that also include requirements on transparency of chemical information. For example, as you know, Article 6 of the Stockholm Convention states that parties to the convention shall develop appropriate strategies for detection products and waste containing POPs listed under the convention. However, the convention actually lacks harmonized disclosure requirements for POPs in products. And as a result, labeling decisions have been made for only 3 POPs, which are HBCD, pentachlorophenol, and PCB so far. And currently, as a result of all this, recyclers have no information about whether the materials they handle contain persistent organic pollutants, which leads to the contamination of the waste stream, right? So next slide, please. However, we believe that there is a very good opportunity to develop a legally binding global treaty that will contain binding, globally harmonized provisions for chemical transparency and traceability. And as you may already guess, it is the Global Plastics Treaty that is currently under negotiation. So by including requirements for chemical information transparency and traceability from the very beginning, the plastic treaty will avoid the gaps that already exist in multilateral chemical conventions. And the problems that conventions have to confront can be avoided, right? So what is important is that by regulating chemicals in plastics, the treaty will not duplicate existing regulations, but will rather complement them. As current conventions address, okay, you please correct me, but not more than 4% related. So we believe that chemical transparency and traceability are really essential for the effectiveness of several proposed articles of the Plastics Treaty, because companies require chemical information from upstream suppliers of plastic components to design products that are suitable for circularity and free from harmful chemicals. And this information informs decisions on waste management and potential future bans on harmful products. And countries should not dismiss transparency and traceability as impossible. As I noted, so the system is already under development or has been even materialized in some jurisdictions as the European Union. And there are UNEP Global Framework for Digital Product Passport, Digital Information System that provides a very clear vision in support of transparency and traceability. And today, a bit later in our second presentation on transparency and traceability systems for plastics, we will talk about the practicability, how to make this disclosure process practical under the Plastics Treaty. And the last slide that I wanted to share with you is actually the link to our websites that we developed jointly by Health and Environment Justice and Sport, Swedish Society for Nature Conservation, and GroundWork South Africa, and where you can find information describing the value of transparency and traceability for the toxic-free circular economy, for the Biodiversity Conservation Convention, for the Plastics Treaty, and more. Very much.
Thank you very much, Olga. About the voluntary initiative already put in place, and then what is available under the Stockholm Convention, which is quite limited. But there is this Article 6 that requires parties to identify, develop strategies to identify, and so on. This is needed because of that waste recycling, plastic recycling, and ensure the safe circularity of plastic. Not for the Stockholm Convention, it's not limited to plastics, but any products and articles that may contain persistent organic pollutant. And thank you very much for the presentation. In this context, like in the contact group on listing and also throughout the POPROC process, it is always topic of discussion how parties can implement these requirements to identify chemicals in plastic. POPs in products and articles. It is. Yes, parallel relationship. So POPs in products and articles and stockpiles and waste. The identifications has been a challenge for many developing countries, not only developing countries, but also developed countries because of complex supply chain and so on. And therefore, at the last conference the parties meeting, when they listed UV328 and Decorum Plus, they mandated the POPs review committee to develop the reform. So next presenter is Mr. Peter Dawson from New Zealand, who is also chair of the POPs review committee to present this reform.
Thank you very much for that introduction. I apologise for my voice. After being here for almost 2 weeks in this building, I'm starting to suffer from the effects of the air conditioning, I think. So yes, as Kei said, we at POPROC, we produced this report on options for identifying POPs in stockpiles, products, articles and use, as well as wastes. And of course, as the chair of the committee, I don't have to do the work myself, but some members of the committee, some of whom are in the room here, had a more significant part in producing this report. So I just thought I'd put this slide up, which I've actually borrowed from Kei. You might see it again in her presentation, which just shows all the POPs that are now already listed under the Stockholm Convention. There's 34 there already, 15 pesticides and 15 industrial chemicals in Annex A, 1 pesticide DDT and 1 industrial chemical PFOS in Annex B for restriction. And then there are 7 POPs listed for the unintentional management of unintentional releases in Annex C. And as we heard already from Kei, there's 3 POPs that are under review at this Conference of the Parties. PFOS, pesticide, of course, and then chlorinated paraffins, and another group of PFAS, long-chain PFCAs, both of which are used in articles and plastic materials. So yeah, just on this slide, it shows that half of the listed POPs, 17 I think, are actually, and it includes a lot of the more recently listed POPs, are substances that are used in manufactured articles, particularly in plastic articles. So we have the brominated flame retardants, chlorinated flame retardant, Decorum Plus, and the PFAS substances that can be used in textiles and plastic articles as well. And I think Kei has a presentation later that goes into this in much more detail. So the chemicals, and we've obviously heard quite a bit about this week. The chemicals that are being considered by the POPROC in recent times and put forward on listing are becoming much more complex than they were originally. Not only in terms of the description and scope and identity of what it is that the substances actually covered, but also the range of uses. And given, again, that we've just heard, like Kei said, that some of these ones are still currently being used, some of them actually currently being used in quite high volumes, there's then often a need for a significant number of specific exemptions, and some of these need quite lengthy time frames to phase them out. One of the ones that we dealt with a wee while ago was decabromodiphenyl ether, a very common brominated flame retardant that's used in an awful lot of plastic materials back a few years. One of the uses was in parts for vehicles, and you could find it in a large number of different parts of a vehicle, and it was going to take time not only to phase out that from the production in those vehicles, but then you would have spare parts because you obviously have to replace a spare part with another part that's of the same standard and quality. And so for that one, there's an exemption for parts for vehicles which run out to the end of the service life of the vehicle or 2036. Then just as we heard from Kei at the last COP, was the listings of Declarant Plus and UV328. Declarant Plus is a chlorinated flame retardant largely, and UV328's main use was as a UV inhibitor. And then both of those had a wide range of uses and very complex uses in medical equipment, everything from missiles and rockets to more simple uses. And so they also had complex exemptions, some of which run until the end of the service life or 2044. Or even longer for medical devices, because these are very sophisticated, expensive pieces of equipment, and rather than having to throw them away, they need to, keep being cleared as long as they can be. And then, of course, at this COP, we had I won't call it the long name, it's just MCCPs, medium chain chlorinated paraffins. I think this is probably the most complex listing recommendation that's ever been put forward to the COP by the POPROC. It's not only a very complicated chemical, the chemical itself is a UCBB. It covers thousands of different individual chemical molecules, and it's defined really by the carbon chain length and the percentage chlorination, and that's used in a wide range of uses as well. Most of the specific exemptions that we've agreed on they might look quite big, but they're actually quite narrow, specific, targeted exemptions. So it is used in metalworking fluids, but the exemption is not for all metalworking fluids. It's for metalworking fluids for only certain specific applications. But again, there's this need for replacement parts for a fairly lengthy period of time. This is a nice slide I've borrowed from Kei, which just shows you the sort of wide range of uses that some POPs like Declarant Plus and UV328 can be found from. So you can see there the missiles and the expensive medical equipment, imaging equipment, tractors, hangers, and other more simple things like coatings of wires and so on. So all of this does lead to the question of how do you identify if a POP is in one of these types of articles? And there's two issues here. One, of course, is you've got products that have already been made and are on the market and then used somewhere. And then on the other hand, you've got the material that will still be coming to the market under the exemptions. So how do you identify it, and how do you manage it when it becomes waste? So next slide. So as Kei just mentioned, these questions were asked at COP 11 when the Declarant Plus and UV328 were listed, and the COP acknowledged that there were these challenges, and so requested the POPROC to consider the options for identifying POPs and stockpiles, products, articles, and waste, and report on the outcome to this COP. So we started our work on that at the POPROC meeting that followed that COP later on in 2023. We then instituted some intersessional work between POPROC 19 and POPROC 20. A questionnaire was sent out to parties and observers to gather information on experiences and challenges that people, parties and observers were encountering, and including to develop strategies to meet that Article 6 requirement that Kei also mentioned of identifying. Oh, sorry, not Olga. Yeah, at her presentation, the identifying POPs and stockpiles and articles and wastes. And then obviously we had a report which we considered at POPROC 20. This was finalised and it's now been published by the Secretariat, thanks to the generous financial assistance from the European Union. And it's also been presented to this COP as document Stockholm document Inf 26. Slide, thanks. And so here's just a little picture of that, the cover of that report. And the QR code where you can access it. And there's a list of the key matters that the report considered, which I'll go into a little bit more in the following slides. Right. So one of the first things we found that there were varying definitions and applications of some of the key terms, like article, for example, and is a stockpile necessarily waste? Or is it a stockpile of material that is still allowed to be used? Slide, please. And another issue is around like the interpretation and application of provisions relating to articles. Now, as we heard in the side event last night by the automotive industry, these interpretations can vary around the world. So if you take something like a pair of scissors, it can be considered that just one blade of the scissors is a manufactured article because it's been designed to a certain shape for a certain purpose. You put the two blades together, you then got a complex article. So the question then arises, if you take something like a pop, that's a wire or a wiring connector, which is an article, and then that's in an electric motor, and then the electric motor might be in that nice aeroplane there. Does that necessarily automatically make the whole aeroplane a POPs article? And there is obviously different interpretations of this around the world. Next slide. Thanks. So we then looked at, given the information that was sent into us, we looked at the approaches that were in place around the world for identifying POPs in products and articles. There's a lot of guidance material under the guidance section on the Stockholm website. There's guidance documents on inventories. These are very useful documents, not legally binding, and I don't necessarily think they're probably terribly widely used, unfortunately. And then there are various reporting requirements in different parts of the world. And again, I've got an example here of the one that Olga showed on the SCIP database in the EU. But often these are not designed specifically for POPs. They are part of general chemicals management framework. Next slide, please. And again, we found obviously approaches to trying to identify POPs and articles varies. There's been a number of surveys done on different industries, car industry, TVs, sets going for disposal, that sort of thing. Sometimes these involve screening techniques, like using X-ray fluorescence to identify brominated flame retardants in the plastic. Sometimes it's just done by physical identification of make or model of an article and its age, which you might know is likely to contain that POPs material. And then there are a number of databases, both in government systems and private sector. And again, last night at the Motor One vehicle side event, we heard about the international material data systems that are widely used for managing chemical information on automotive components. I was hoping the automotive experts would still be here, but unfortunately, I don't think they are. But Timo's quite an expert. He has the same name as the expert, so might have rubbed off. Might have rubbed off on him. Next slide, thanks. And that was really the approaches to identifying in articles. We also looked at approaches on identifying POPs and wastes. And here there is already a lot of guidance material available. We have the POPs waste guidelines under the Basel Convention. Under Stockholm, we have the inventory guidelines I just mentioned before, and then there's also BAT guidelines for POPs waste management processes. Around the world as well, there are some places reporting requirements. Even in New Zealand, we shortly will be introducing reporting requirements for POPs waste operators. Next slide. Okay, so there's a lot of challenges. We found there were all these challenges with identifying the POPs and articles and waste. That's already been alluded to. There's clearly capacity challenges, both financial, technical, and human resource challenges. Testing for POPs and articles is a very expensive exercise. And as I've mentioned, there's these global regulatory challenges with different regulations in place around the world. And generally, there's for countries, even countries like New Zealand, where we basically import all these manufactured articles, there's no real system or way for being able to identify if there are POPs and articles coming in. Yep, so just again quickly, I'll skip over these. I'm running out of time. So there's obviously a lot of data gaps, lack of traceability at the moment. There's the complexity in the value chains. I gave you the example before on a wire or wiring connector that might then be in a motor or a computer that's then in an aircraft. And those type of articles could be used, of course, in a large number of different value chains. We had the labelling. Olga mentioned the labelling requirements that are in the convention for 3 chemicals. Apart from labelling, say, PCB equipment, those labelling provisions haven't been all that useful. I mean, clearly there's the labelling for when you have a chemical substance like PFOS or PFIRO in a firefighting foam that's easily labelled. The uses for labelling PCP and PCB treated wood. I believe Canada has done some work there on tagging and identifying PCB treated wood. The labelling requirement for HBCD and polystyrene in New Zealand, when we discussed this with the industry, we found that that was not going to be at all practical. So what happened with there, we actually opted out of the listing just for a year, which then gave the industry time to access the alternative flame retardant. And there was no need then to take up the exemption that was provided under the listing that had the labelling provision. Next slide. So just on labelling, obviously there are physical labelling requirements like I've mentioned just there. And now we're moving into the availability of digital labelling or marking on articles. Like, for example, we've got here an ISO standard that is used in Argentina to use codes to indicate the presence of brominated flame retardants in plastics. And there's these digital product passports in the EU that I don't really know any more about, but hopefully Timo will be able to enlighten us on. And of course, there's a lot of challenges with labelling. You know, physical labels may not endure over time; they may get lost. There's the question of labelling of complex articles. How do you really label these small parts that are in a complicated thing like a plane or a car? And then there's also questions of the feasibility. So, for example, you might, if you did label a small part in a car, when the car gets to the end of its life cycle, it's not usually dismantled carefully part by part. You know, you pick out the wee part that has the pop. The car just goes off through the shredder. So any labelling that was there is basically going to be lost. Yeah, and of course the issue is that unfortunately by the time something gets listed as a POP, it's already too late to label it because the POP is largely already out there in the articles, and you can't really retrospectively label those. Next slide, so this is my last one. So we had a number of conclusions in the report. Clearly, there's a need to reduce the burden on countries, especially developing countries, on importing POPs and articles. This need to improve the transparency in the value chains, improve the capacity building and knowledge sharing. There are these databases and systems around the world that can be used to identify POPs, and improve the harmonisation and the use of these. And finally, down the bottom, just promote these digital labelling schemes and databases that are more frequently coming available. So thank you very much. That's my
Thank you. Thank you very much, Peter. Presentation of what POPs Review Committee has provided in the report, but I think I heard more challenges than solutions.
Yes.
This is how complex this issue is. And also, a very important thing that Olga mentioned earlier about information disclosure. So, well, inside, like in the value chain, you might identify things, but you label it and then it gets lost. And the information needs to be communicated to whoever needs to make sure these are managed in an environmentally sound manner. But some countries like Finland, I heard, is doing something very practical. And is it me? I thought it was Timo's turn, but apparently it was my turn to present. So I think there is this very experienced and knowledgeable expert in Roland Weber. Dr. Roland Weber, present in this room, just handed me this little gift with the jam. So we heard a lot about the industrial chemicals, and that sounds so far away from us about chemicals, transparency in chemicals in products. But we also have, concern about how consumer products might contain chemicals and how it is. And we also heard about digital passport and so on. And I'm not advertising, but you can download some of the interesting apps. And one I have here is called YUKA, Y-U-K-A. If you download it, it allows you to scan this barcode here. Then if you scan it, it tells me what this product is. No, this is pesto. Genovese Bittinienenkeren. Well, I mean, content now is different because he put his own homemade jam. Thank you very much. But this one application will tell me that this contains salt, 2 grams, which is too much with a red dot. It also says how much protein is, how much fiber is positive, and it has an information about additive. And it says no risky additives. So you see, this also provides options. So this is a food, but other products like shampoo, conditioner, whatever product, if you have barcodes, scan it, and if it is registered, information about it. I think information disclosure, really an example that is already available, not necessarily chemicals in plastics, but such technology exists. And yes, so let's go into my presentation. Slide, please. So with the high interest of chemicals in plastics, and that some of the chemicals are covered under the existing multilateral environmental agreements or voluntary, we have used some publications, one called Global Governance of Plastics and Associated Chemicals, and another one addressing chemicals of concern in plastics through multilateral environmental agreements. In this publication, we tried to analyze what kind of chemicals are already covered, what are the mechanisms to identify chemicals of concern, and so on. Next, please. And together with UNEP, we also developed Chemicals in Plastics, a technical report. This one is, yes, developed by UNEP and identifying chemicals of concern based on the studies that are conducted by academia and different also experts. Joining all the information together, the findings was telling us that a lot of chemicals of concern present or used in plastics are not globally regulated. Please. Right, so chemicals in plastics can impact in so many different stages, from production and use and recycling and disposal. So labeling and transparency traceability needs to take into account these different stages. Next, please. And the publication analyzed those existing multilateral environmental agreements or voluntary instruments that addresses plastics, chemicals in plastics, including Basel, Rotterdam, and Stockholm Conventions, as well as Minamata and Montreal Protocol. Next, please. So we all know what, hopefully, we have the criteria set up in our convention, the Stockholm Convention. Next, please. And the chemicals criteria are recommended for listing under the Stockholm Convention, and the conference of parties take decision on listing. The convention started with 12 chemicals, and now it has 35 because the chemicals are adopted. So yes, as of today, yes, in long chain, therefore it's 36 listings. Thank you very much for great reminder. 36 listings. And those related, some of them have related compounds that covers hundreds of chemicals. I think Peter said thousands are in it. Yes. Well, chlorinated paraffins is not yet adopted, and therefore, yes, still 36. Next, please. And yeah, we have half of them are related to plastics. And here, this figure is Rotterdam listing chemicals, and you can see many are overlapping, listed in both conventions. And yeah, some were concerned raised, like, if you are listed in multiple conventions, aren't they duplicative impact and so on? But each convention has its own objective, and they're legally autonomous, and the parties have obligations to implement these conventions, and they are complementary to each other. Next, please. But yes, as mentioned in that chemicals and plastics report, there are so many chemicals of concern not covered by the Stockholm Convention. Why is that? Could be currently under review by the FOPROC, but have not been listed, like chlorinated medium chain chlorinated paraffins, not yet, or do not meet the criteria for listing under the Stockholm Convention. Enough and so on. Or do not have enough information to determine. So like 10 years ago, medium chain chlorinated paraffins was considered, well, was not yet meeting the criteria, but later it was nominated for listing when this is because more information became available. Or there are persistent and bioactive, toxic and long-range environmental transport potential, but parties have not submitted for proposal for listing. There are such chemicals exist a lot. So examples are there, like PAHs. Now, PBDD and PBDFs are actually proposed for listing and under review. Linear alkyl benzenes, they're contained in detergents. Nonyl phenol, octyl phenol, you might have heard plastic additives. Bisphenol A or phthalates. Those plastic additives are not covered by the convention. And then there's a process under the Stockholm Convention. It's a process for identifying and reviewing and listing the chemicals. And so this is the FOPS review committee. Mr. Peter Lawson is the chair of the committee. And the most important statement that the committee is to make is that here in that green text, the chemical is likely, as a result of its long-range environmental transport, to lead to significant adverse human health and environmental effects such that global action is warranted. So all of the POPs meet this statement. Next, please. So this, as mentioned, so the Stockholm Convention embeds very detailed screening criteria, which is used in the process for reviewing the chemicals, using those 4 very important POPs properties. Next, please. And then the committee develops risk profile that describes these properties, and then the committee to reach to the conclusion whether the chemical is likely as a result of its long-range environmental transport lead to significant adverse human health and or environmental effects such that global action is warranted. Next, please. Yes, so this UV328 was this was a proposal by Switzerland and listed in the COP11 meeting. And then it's one of the unique chemical. It's not halogenated, that doesn't contain any halogens, but still meeting the POPs criteria and found in different places as plastic. Next, please. And then the very important step of analyzing the chemical is an F risk management evaluation. Here, the chemical transparency and so on will also be very important because it also needs to identify alternatives and the waste implication. In this process, at the Annex F stage, it is very important for industrial chemicals. Special care is needed because it has very complicated supply chain. And here, the traceability and transparency would be very important. Thank you. Right, so in my next few slides, I just want to highlight what are other conventions relevant to plastic chemicals. So Minamata Convention on Mercury is about mercury, but there's an in Annex B, it lists manufacturing processes, polyurethane manufacturing and vinyl chloride manufacturing production, monomer production. This is where mercury can be used in the processes. Next, please. And Montreal Protocol, the ozone depleting substances are also relevant to this process because it could be used as a blowing agents. And so these are listed under the Montreal Protocol. So I would be very happy if you can get my QR code and access to the publication. Next, please. I think this was my last. Oh, yes. Of course, the Basel Convention. Plastic Waste Amendments adopted in 2019 clarifies this hazardous plastic waste needs to be subject to prior informed consent procedure. And for that purpose, it is important to identify which plastic waste contain hazardous constituents. Right. Thank you very much. So, I'm the moderator and I probably exceeded my time limit, but now I would like to listen to very interesting experience sharing from Finland regarding POPs in articles and also how managed.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation and organizing this event. So we heard a lot in Olga's presentation about the needs, the various needs for having more information on what chemicals we have in products, and also in Peter's presentation about the work POPs Review Committee did about the challenges. And I'm going to present a little different perspective, and it's the perspective of a government who is trying to implement Stockholm Convention and also implement Basel Convention for that matter. Can I have the next slide? And actually the second slide. So there are, in Stockholm Convention, if we look at it, there are several reasons why you would need the information. And I'm not talking about POPs only, because I'm a competent authority for POPs regulation in the EU, and we are in BRS COP. But of course, the same issues and same problems will be relevant for all other chemicals. But for the needs of the Stockholm Convention, they are like to enforce Article 3, you would have to know the chemical content. To monitor prohibition of it, you also would need to know the content of a POP in a mixture or article to control import and export. Furthermore, we have Article 6 in Stockholm Convention, which talks about stockpiles waste, and there is a requirement to develop strategies for identifying stockpiles consisting of or containing chemicals listed in this ABC, and identifying products and articles in use. And finally, of course, the waste management requirement, which is in Article 6, which requires the waste, including products and articles upon becoming waste, are treated according to Article 6, which the requirement is that the POPs content is destroyed. However, as Peter noted, articles are not defined in Stockholm Convention, products are not defined. This is the typical situation where interpretation of the convention is left to the parties. Next slide. So the interpretation is of course done with the national legislation. In the European Union, we are very good at creating legislation. We are known to legislate ourselves in the corner sometimes, and this is what happens. But because 27 countries are trying to create a level platform for all those operating, sometimes it gets complicated. I mean, we know it from experience from this meeting that the more parties you have in the room, the more complicated it is because more views you have. And another thing that is worthwhile noting is that whenever the party implements, for example, Stockholm Convention, it has to be put in the context of its other legislation. And consequently, you start having different definitions, you start having different other legislative parts. So these are not at all uniform. And I very much have sympathy for yesterday, those who were in the auto industry side event here, where they were complaining about the fact that Stockholm Convention is implemented in different ways in different countries. And that's why it's really difficult for them to figure out like how do you do it in each and every country, because they would have to really go through deep into this legislation. Anyway, in the European Union, we have implemented the Stockholm Convention with this POPs regulation 2019-1021, which entered into force in 2019. We had the previous POPs regulation as well, but which was in force since 2004 when we ratified the Stockholm Convention. But the reason why it had to be changed was really because the surroundings were changing. The other legislative environment was changing. The whole REACH regulation had entered into force after we had already had this first POPs legislation. So this is a dynamic process. And this partially has a lot to do with the fact that it's very complicated to follow. Can I have the next slide? So the way Stockholm Convention that requires that each party shall prohibit production and use of the chemicals. We have exactly the same requirement in our POPs regulation, which requires that the manufacturing, placing on the market, and the use of substances listed in Annex 1, which is practically the same as Annex A in Stockholm Convention, whether on their own, in mixtures, or in articles, shall be prohibited. So this already is a little wider requirement than we have in the Stockholm. Furthermore, what we have here is that unlike in Stockholm Convention, we do have mixtures and articles. So this is really, we do not use the term products in this legislation. We do have in Article 2 of the POPs regulation, we do have definitions, and we have definitions for use, we have definitions for import, we have definition for stockpiles, unintentional trace contamination, lots of language that is used in Stockholm Convention, but it's not defined in Stockholm Convention because the definition is for the parties, because of the reasons I mentioned. For example, prohibition of placing on the market also covers import into the EU area. And if you want to control import, if you want to control the use, or rather monitor whether chemical is used, you would require information on the presence of what on the market. Next slide, please. Article 6, stockpile requirements. Stockholm Convention requires parties to develop strategies to identify stockpiles, but it doesn't really specify what is a stockpile. So that's also done in the party, and this was one of the findings in the POPROC study last year, the project that different parties use the word stockpiles in different ways. For some, it means waste, and for some, like in the European Union, we do have a definition for it. Stockpile means those articles or mixtures, the use of which is still allowed, which basically means that those that are produced under an exemption. And as soon as the exemption expires, those stockpiles cease to exist because they become waste. But as you can see, we are using stockpiles in a very different way than some others might be using. And everybody remembers that FAO had this Africa stockpiles program. And did the stockpiles refer to in that? It referred to pesticide waste. So no wonder that it's a little complicated. Anyway, the requirement in the EU legislation specifies that if you hold a stockpile which contains any substance that is listed in this regulation, which are the Stockholm Convention substances only, for which no use is permitted, it will be considered waste. However, if the exemption is still valid, the holder of the stockpile, if it's greater than 50 kilos, has to provide information to the competent authority in Finland about the nature and size of this stockpile. Well, this is really easy if the stockpile you have is, let's say, pesticide that is still allowed to be used or under specific exception. You know that it's 50 kilos and so on. But what if the stockpile is like we had yesterday in the examples, we had a fuel pump of a car, and it contains the sealant that contains PFOA that is restricted there. So then the question really comes to the interpretation of, okay, is this fuel pump, is it an article that contains POPs, or is it just this gasket that is there? And if it's just a gasket, how much does it weigh? How many fuel pumps do you need to get to this 50 kilos? And perhaps more importantly, if you are a car spare part chain or shop that has like fuel pumps for every imaginable car brand and model and make, how do you know which ones of those contain PFOA containing sealant? So difficulties come. Information on the presence of POPs would be needed. These car part shops would have to have information that yes, this is something you have to notify to the authorities. Regrettably, and I think this is kind of a mistake well, I can say a mistake, even though other European Commission is not here. Well, it's a future. This 12-month period, let's say the restriction of a POP enters into force on January 1st. By the January 1st next year, you have to notify the stockpiles. The exemption expires in 5 years from this entry into force. After that, you don't have to notify the stockpiles. You just have to create them as well. So while companies and stakeholders are trying to figure out, like, okay, do we have this 50 kilos? Or should we report? And do we have to, like, we have fuel pumps, and then we have just these gaskets, like, do we have to add these together, etc., etc. Lots of problems. But the first problem is that they wouldn't know that they have articles that they would have notified. Next slide, please. And then, of course, Article 6 requirement of Stockholm Convention on waste. This has been transposed into the EU POPs regulation, Article 7, where it says that waste consisting of, containing, or contaminated by any substance listed in Annex 4. Now, this is complicating because Annex 4 is just the list where all the POP substances are, but it also contains the low POP content limit values, which we have negotiated on the Basel as well. So they basically follow what we are trying to do is that the limit values that we apply in the European Union would also be found in the Basel Convention technical guidelines for POPs waste. Nevertheless, if you want to know whether this is waste that I would have to manage according to this Article 7, the legally binding requirement in the European Union, you would have to know that in many cases it's of course easy. Many stakeholders and companies know that this is POP because we have used it ourselves, or we know that we have bought this, so this is a POP. But there are lots of other types of waste where you would not know. Next slide, please. So this is just an example of how we have transposed the Basel low POP content limit values in our legislation, and what it really means that if the POP content in the waste is at or above the limit value in Annex 4, then it has to be destroyed. If it's below the flow pop content limit value, but it's below what is considered unintentional trace contamination, which is in Annex A, no, bill I. But we do have a numerical value so that every and each EU country would use the same level for, I think, what is considered a pop-containing article. This is complicated. But anyway, you have to know how much there is in the waste to know how you are supposed to treat this waste. Next slide, please. So I'm coming back to this stockpile notification, and now all of these requirements, once they are put into the national legislation to comply with the Stockholm Convention requirements, they are legally binding. They are legally binding for everybody. So when companies are, for example, required to notify about their stockpile, I'm talking again about these fuel piles. It is a legal requirement, and we also have in Article 18 to the POPs regulation saying that the maximum punishment is up to 2 years in prison, which is likely not going to happen if you don't notify your stockpile. But there are other cases where the persistent organic pollutant type of happen. So we have had this stockpile notification requirement since the new POPs regulation entered into force in 2019. So basically, when a new POP is listed in the legislation, typically within a year after the Stockholm Convention restriction enters into force, because we have this 1 year period for that. From that, within 12 months, we should start. There should be a flood of stockpile notifications. But it doesn't happen. And we have noticed that, and especially this is typical for now. So first of all, the stakeholders, which I mean the companies and also trade, they don't seem to be aware of this requirement so that they would be able to notify stockpiles. Yes, we do have an Excel sheet where you could put your stockpiles on our website, and we do have that, hey, it's time for you to notify your stockpiles, but it's not often seen in it. So there should be a communication campaign, but we wouldn't know to whom we would put it because we don't know which articles contain some of these POPs that are especially present in plastic. Another problem, in a way, is that the stakeholders could basically just sit out the stockpile notification requirement. As soon as the exemption for use expires and use and place in the market, stockpile notification is not there anymore. They become waste, and then you just have to make sure that you do the waste management in line with Article 7. So what I can say as a national authority is that we have received very, very few notifications, and all of those notifications have been about firefighting foam. And even when we require that, you would have to notify the stockpiles of firefighting foams. The notifications do contain a list of all firefighting foams that they have. Certainly all AFFF foams, which are PFAS-based. But whether those are actually POP-containing PFAS waste or not, they wouldn't know because they don't really have any information how much PFOA there is or how much PFHXS there is, or long chain BFCAs that we hopefully have some listed already last. So this is a problem. Like it's not only on articles, it's also on mixtures. And this is something that the reason that because of this, POPs Review Committee recommended that the supply chain should improve the information flow when it comes to chlorinated parabens. And we finalized the decision yesterday in the contract. And also, I think that one of the issues that we seldom come to think of from the point of view of companies is that they also should be aware of these these folks, because otherwise they might be violating the legislation. They might get into legal trouble. And even if you could be relatively certain that if you are, for example, using or you are holding firefighting foams which contain PFOA, so that they would fall under the Stockholm Convention, you could be relatively sure that, okay, the authorities will likely never come and sample it and then measure. But what if there is a fire? There is a fire, and you use all that foam, and then there is the fire waters go into the environment, and then there's a measurement that what do we have in the groundwater, what do we have in the nearby lake, and then it turns out that actually this was illegal foam. What does your insurance company say about it? So there are lots of reasons why the companies should be aware of this, and this is not at all satisfactory. We have been looking at the firefighting foams, especially in the recent times, because the phase out of PFOA containing foams is this year. And it's really, really, well, I would say that it's almost impossible to see based on any documentation whether there is a pop, whether it's a pop foam or whether it's just a regular thing. And now I see that Kei is standing up, so can I have the next? So yeah, one more thing. Last year, I asked all my EU fellow authorities that how many notifications have you received on article? None. None in the whole European Union. And I think this really crystallizes the problem in many ways, that we do have legislation which is great. I mean, this would be great, and it would solve it. It would be a great way to implement Stockholm Convention if we just have the data. Next slide. Now, my final thing that I wanted to say is that, of course, we do market surveillance. We go and measure things that are on the market. But this is not very common. Typically in Europe, it's a coordinated effort that countries agree that, hey, this year we will measure firefighting foams, this year we will measure cosmetics, and this year we will measure raincoats, etc. So all of these violations, I mean, different hazards, not only chemical hazards, are collected in this safety gate. It's available online for everybody. And if we have the next slide. So there are these alerts. I took a query or a search on PBDEs, and there were a couple of, I think there were like 11 findings of articles that had exceeded the legal PBDE values. So you can choose their one. And next slide, please. And then you get to the actual report from a national authority where they have found this violation, and you can see the brand. And basically what happens is that this is the way they inform the other authorities in the other countries, because we are a single market, that this should be pulled out from the market. And can I have the next slide? And then there is also this explanation about the nature of the risk. And I did also have a look at this for PFASs, all PFASs, not only FOBs. And I think we had since 2018, the whole European Union had like 11 products that were pulled out because of it. And if looking at PFOA, I think it was rather like 4. So that actually concludes my presentation. So conclude as I
sharing the real examples and some stories behind Finland and how these legally binding requirements are translated into national context. I mean, also for EU is a regional context. And I think it is quite important to, yes, and helpful when you think about how this can be considered in the context of plastics. So we will have 2 more presentations online,
But not so long.
not so long, not so long. And also, no one else will come into this room, so we can go a little bit beyond. Yes, of course, but everyone's quite busy. And so let's try to keep in time. The next presenter will be Mr. André Prevodnik from Svenska Natur Skyddsforeningen.
Almost correct. Thank you, Kei.
No, I should almost correct. Yes.
Yeah.
I was practicing that while this last presentation. We'll be giving the practicability of identifying chemicals in materials and products. Please go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Kei. So good evening, everyone from Stockholm. So in this part of the side event, I will cover how transparency and traceability systems could look like and work in practice, for example, for plastics. Okay, and next slide, please. Because chemicals are constituents of manufactured materials, we can only ensure safe and resource efficient management of the materials and products if the management is informed by information of the chemical composition. To enable this, we need three basic conditions to be established. First of all, we need a harmonized approach for disclosing the presence, identity, and hazard class information for chemicals in manufactured materials and products. And why harmonized? Well, lack of harmonization translates into multiple standards, non-consistent product safety levels between various manufacturers and jurisdictions, and unnecessary costs for verifying standards, which may complicate for companies weak in resources to participate in supply chains and burdens also customs services and governmental authorities with compliance responsibilities. Harmonization introduces predictability for companies and levels the playing field, saves costs, and can introduce a minimum level of product safety concerning chemicals irrespective of jurisdiction. In addition, most supply chains nowadays are multinational, so it makes sense to harmonize the requirements across them. And once we have agreed upon the approach, we can agree upon the negative list of chemicals to disclose and disclosure thresholds. Secondly, we need to be able to establish a link between the disclosed chemical information and individual manufactured items in order to establish traceability. And thirdly, we need to define stakeholder responsibilities in relation to the other two conditions. And I will now deliberate a little bit more on the two latter conditions. Next slide, please. To be useful for resource efficient and safe management of manufactured items, disclosed chemical identity and hazard information must be traceable. This means that the disclosed information is linked to individual items, including to their constituent components. To ensure this, we should use a combination of physical markings or labelings and digitally stored data. For markings or physical labeling, there is no all-fit solution because of various material characteristics, including differences in lifespans and differences in value chains. But it should be possible to set up guidelines for how a manufacturer should think when choosing the physical marker or label. A rule of thumb is that a marker or label in an ideal situation should have a lifespan matching the lifespan of the manufactured item it's intended for. And ideally, marking or label should also be readable when the manufactured item is dismantled or disintegrates as waste. And ideally, all constituent components of a manufactured product should carry markers or labels. Next slide, please. In this slide are a few potential markings or labels. We can collectively call them data carriers. The list is by no means exhaustive, and you can read more in, for example, the article that you can find at the bottom of the slide where you have the link. Classic labels are hang-on tags or stickers or prints on the packaging of a product. The immediate advantage of a classic label is that they can contain information that is readable visually without support of any technical equipment. In addition, they could contain information that can be accessed, for example, by scanning, and I will soon give you a couple of examples. Such labels are useful for quick information to buyers of products and enable informed purchases, but are easily lost or destroyed or worn out before the end of life of the article. Thus, standalone, they are not very useful for supporting the sound life cycle management of materials. Barcodes, QR codes, or watermarks can also be applied on hang-on tags or on stickers, or be printed onto the surface of materials. In the form of stickers or material imprints, they should be more durable. There is an interesting example from the EU, an initiative called the Holy Grail 2.0 initiative for plastics. It's based on tiny watermarks that are arranged in a repeated lattice and printed all over the surface of plastic products via the casting molds. Information can be read in a sorting machine, and to our understanding also from fragmented pieces of plastics. Full-scale systems show that this works, and maybe similar systems could also be developed for other materials than plastics. To read information from barcodes, QR codes, and watermarks, technical equipment is needed, but it doesn't have to be complicated or expensive solutions. Detection is based on optical reading via a camera, and a dedicated app in, for example, a cell phone could provide the scanning function necessary. Then we also have radio frequency markers. An obvious disadvantage with them is that they run on electricity. So a battery source is needed, which raises the question whether the battery could last throughout the entire life cycle of the label item. It also requires specific detection equipment, as for example, a normal cell phone does not have the necessary hardware. Moreover, it's also a more expensive marker than the ones that I have mentioned so far. And it cannot cover the entire surface of an article, rather is confined to a specific part of it and can thus get easily lost when the product is dismantled or disintegrates. Additional markings or labeling options are the use of chemical markers and synthetic DNA. Chemical markers may be useful for plastics, for example, but for other materials, these categories of markers have more limited uses. And synthetic DNA in particular requires time-consuming analysis and expensive laboratory equipment. And you can read more about the details in the peer-reviewed paper, as I said, with the link at the bottom of the page. Next slide, please. Following from what I just talked about, a data carrier does not necessarily need to contain text that can be read directly visually by a person. The data can be stored externally in a database in a format that we could call the digital product passport. In fact, because the physical markings and labels are worn out or get lost during the life cycle of a manufactured item, it's highly recommended to store its chemical composition data digitally. To establish the link between the physical marking or labeling and digitally stored data, we need what I here call a product identifier. It can be a numerical or a letter code embedded, for example, in a barcode, QR code, or watermark. And the digital product passport of the corresponding manufactured item carries the same numerical or letter code. The numerical code can be detected, or the letter code can be detected with an appropriate equipment. In this infographic, visualized by the cell phone and a dedicated app. Once the code is read, the app retrieves the information from the digital product passport of the corresponding product and displays it on screen on the cell phone. For such a system to be interoperable and work efficiently across multinational supply chains and between companies, we also need to agree upon the format of the digital product passport. This ensures that the structure, semantics, and technical specifications, etc., of the data in the passport are uniform. The current harmonization effort that was also mentioned by Olga and is repeated on this slide is the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe Transparency Protocol for Digital Product Passports. Next slide, please. And finally, for legally binding transparency and traceability systems to function, it's also very important to define stakeholder responsibilities in national legislation. It should be clear that manufacturers are required to test their final products for the chemicals in the negative list and disclose the ones exceeding the agreed disclosure thresholds and present it in the agreed format of the digital products passport. by entering the data into a publicly available database. Furthermore, they should be required to label the materials and products with appropriate data carriers. If they are manufacturers of composite products with components from several upstream suppliers, they should be required to compile new digital product passports for the final product, reflecting the disclosed chemical composition of the constituent component. To enable this, of course, we must ensure that they get access to the digital product passports in the required format from all component suppliers. Importers of products should be required to make sure that the products that they place on the market are accompanied with the digital product passports in the required format before the products are allowed onto the market. It should also be clear who is responsible for making the spot checks to verify that the information in the digital product passports is correct. And finally, there should also be a penalty system in place to discourage cheating. So in the interest of time, I had to rush a little bit and I stopped there and I hand the word back to Kei. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you very much for giving us some practical examples and some potential also to be considered by the BRS report will very much benefit these examples, I think, for the identification of chemicals in plastics. Now let's hear a bit about from the developing countries perspective. And the next speaker is Mr. Rico Yurikido from groundWork South Africa. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Kei, and I'll be brief. In the interest of time and in the interest of taking some questions from the floor. So we've heard about the framing of the problem from the speakers, and we've also heard now of possible modalities in order to put in place this global transparency and traceability system. But I think for us in low middle income countries, it's really important to understand what the benefits of this kind of system would be. And I think fundamentally, the reason why we would want such a system is so that we could protect public health of workers, of communities, of consumers. In low middle income countries, it is waste pickers and informal waste recyclers that are managing articles and products that contain these hazardous chemicals. And it is only through having this kind of global system at a global level that low middle income countries who are net importers of articles and products can make good decisions about what they want to let into their countries and what they want to exclude. And the simple reason for that is that we simply cannot afford to set up control systems at our ports of entry of these imports of these products and articles. We've already heard in the EU that compliance testing and that monitoring in the actual market is very seldom. So unless we have this global system that levels the playing field for everybody, and in particular for small manufacturers, for small producers, who will all benefit from having this global system that requires this disclosure so that ultimately good decisions can be made. We in the NGO civil society sector have done many spot checks to see whether or not hazardous chemicals end up in materials and whether or not they are recycled. And these spot checks, they frequently show that the recyclates are cross-contaminated with hazardous chemicals. And in particular, it is the most vulnerable people, the people who are least able to protect themselves, such as waste pickers in these informal recycling operations that exists across all of our economies in these low middle income countries. that are ultimately impacted by these hazardous chemicals. Additionally, the communities that live near recycling facilities or production facilities are also affected by these harmful chemicals because it ends up in the water, in the soil, in the air, and it also potentially affects their food sources. So for us, we find that unless we can have a global system that will give low middle income countries, poorly resourced, that don't have the laboratory capacity, if we don't give them a system and an option of excluding these products and articles from their economies, they will never ever be able to protect themselves. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
We've heard a perspective also from developing countries. I would like to now hand over to Alexandra for the recommendations.
Thank you. This is, I promise, the very last slide between you and your deserved night. We collected a few recommendations that are a bit like a summary of you heard today from all our speakers. So it is very important to recognize that we need a globally harmonized mandatory transparency and traceability system. I would like to repeat this: globally harmonized and mandatory. This gives us a level playing field on a global level. And it is also very good, more convenient for industry because they have only to notify once and not to, I don't know how many different systems. We are in our team with SSNC, groundWork, and we at HEJSupport, we're advocating very much to achieve this globally harmonized transparency and traceability system also in the plastic treaty negotiations. This is where we can establish a mandatory disclosure system of the chemical identity and hazards, and at the minimum 4 chemicals of concern in plastic products and articles. So therefore, what can you do? Talk to your delegates. If you're a delegate, talk to your colleagues who work on the plastic treaty, and make sure that there is a provision on this system in the treaty. That would really be the first step towards a more comprehensive system. And in detail, it means support Article 3, paragraph 8 bis, just to be very precise here. An article like this would include a placeholder in the plastic treaty. And later, because we think it will not be able to spell out all the details in the next INC, so later this placeholder should be used to really develop this system in detail. Then we heard already that there are several approaches and initiatives that are currently being developed. And you see it on the slide. It is really important that these approaches and initiatives work together so that they become harmonized and not exist in parallel in a silo. This has to be really like coming together like a net so that, as I said, do not fall into this trap that we have different parallel systems that cannot work together. And finally, to make this all legally binding and bring everything together, we would need a resolution at UNEA, which calls for the development of a binding transparency and a traceability system for chemicals and products and materials. So this is it in a nutshell, what we can all do, what we can work for, and what delegates can do, civil society can do, and also industry can do. And so from our side, we thank you very much. Also, Kei, thank you so much. But I hand over to you.
Right. I think to the point, key recommendations that were presented by Health and Environment Justice Support. And yeah, having heard, we would like to do some little questions and answer session. If you have any questions from the floor to ask to experts. Yes, please.
Hi. Well, first of all, I completely agree that we need to make all the plastic treaty converge with everything else. But I think there might be an opportunity to rationalize the challenges that we have in the existing instruments that we have, especially in the EU. There's a ton of instruments that could be working together to achieve the same kind of traceability goals. And there's all this reporting that the private sector needs to do. And I think that if there's a harmonization of all having to be translated, and for example, in the EU, you have the regulation for the eco design for sustainability product, the ESRP, that is the implementing for the digital product passport. You also have regulations on the sustainable supply chains, right? And the supply chain due diligence directive that needs to be transposed into national law. You have all in the UK, you have the regulation against modern slavery. So all of this information is having to be collected, right? But it's just pieces of legislation, pieces of regulation, pieces of directives. And of course, we all already are very familiar with challenges between directives and regulations that could encourage further disclosure, if only we could put them in a way that is coherent for the private sector to report, right? Because now you have to report about plastics. And then the conversation we're having yesterday, is it the content, right? And today it's not a material of concern, but tomorrow it might be a material of concern. Well, if we could give like the same thing you have for ingredients for food, well, here's the ingredients, and we can keep them protected by the guarantee of the government. Like we'll keep the next secret, but we know that it's in there, right? And when it becomes a thing of concern, then it becomes public. If then you also have to disclose the environmental impact of the processing, together with the origin that is also for the customs reasons or for trade reasons, it has to be disclosed, right? So I think that the call to action is 100% spot on. Like the example of the plastics treaty and the fact that it's not really gelling and coordinated with Basel is mind-boggling to me. But then on top of that, having to say, well, we also have this other huge body of international agreements and instruments that are all looking for essentially the same thing, which is protecting the people on this planet. And we're just not finding a way to bring them together. So it's not about creating more. It's about perhaps at some point just sitting down and thinking, how can we, and this is the question, how can we make all of this body of regulation become more rationalized for one side of the private sector, but also for the public sector that needs to deal with it in all of the enforcement and supervision efforts. So that's
great. That's a very, very good point, and that's why you're here discussing about participating in BRS COPs, but also aware of all these other chemicals and management framework, including for future plastics. Yes, I think. Would you like to continue moderation? Because I really need to. But
no, I think we say thank you all for being here.
Yes,
and you have your deserved rest.
Yes.
And we appreciate very much that you were with us at that late time and after all these days of work. And please reach out
much to Kei,
yes,
for moderation and for Peter and for Tina for participation. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
And yeah, we hope that we will be in touch.
Yes.
That's okay.